And I think we're live. Almost. And we're live. Thank you.
Okay. Mike. Hello, everybody. Mike is a word for hello for people in mute language. I'm glad you could make it today. I'm going to be sharing the true Thanksgiving. And so I use videos, and today is a special day. I brought some buffalo stew that y'all can share with and enjoy. So without further ado, this is one of the films that the Penobscot, who were the first ones that the Pilgrims supposedly had Thanksgiving with. But their version and what we've all learned in school are two different things, and so I try to make sure that my films tell the truth. Sometimes that's a hard pill to swallow, but we just never get that other side, and so that's what I'm going to show. And we want to get those lights too. Great. And we're live on streaming.
Yep.
And so you can catch us at home. Want to welcome all the troops out there at home and hope you enjoy the films. Too bad you can't get in on the buffalo stew and the fry bread. It was my first attempt at fry bread, so I'm not guaranteeing anything. And so I bought some rolls just in case. And so we'll indulge after this first one, because the second one is going to be talking about the food that they did have at the first Thanksgiving meal.
Nataswis Nanuita, Ka Kitty Hendricks, New Tomas, Mississippi.
My name is Linda Jeffers Coombs, Aquina Wampanoag Tribe, Mashpee resident.
Hi, I'm Stephen Peters. I am a citizen of the Mashpee Wampanoag Tribe, and I live here in Mashpee as well with my family.
My name is Robert Peters. I'm a Mashpee Wampanoag artist, writer.
I'm Miles Bernadette Peters. I live here in Mashpee, Massachusetts. I'm a member of the Mashpee Wampanoag Tribe.
My name is Danielle Hill, and I am also called Running Water, and I'm from Mashpee.
Thanksgiving is essentially a product of America becoming the country that it is now, which was formed at the expense of Wampanoag and Native people. Because for America to happen and for people to give thanks for this holiday, America had to change, remove, kill, ship out of the country Native people to make that happen.
So Thanksgiving is certainly it's a confusing time to be Wampanoag, because on one hand you've got a long weekend with no work, and there's nothing to do other than be with family and eat food and watch football and watch a parade. And on the other hand, as you start to grow up, you learn the history of your tribe and your people and what they endured. We're not sitting around giving thanks that the Pilgrims had this bountiful harvest and really marked the beginning of the end of our people. But instead, we're really giving thanks for our people's perseverance in being able to overcome all of those obstacles so that we could be here today.
You wouldn't even think of really trying to go back on that tradition of families getting together. But that was my people that it's about. It's kind of participating in an insult to have that. And I think there's an awareness from anybody that's native that brings the turkey out and puts it in the middle of the table. It's like I'm being the butt of a joke.
Thanksgiving for me is, it's a day really when, just like everybody else, we get together and eat and gather and come together as a family. The true like meaning behind Thanksgiving is like the giving of thanks. And I try to, every time I'm out with these children, you know, we do morning ceremonies, go to sunrise ceremonies and give thanks and give our prayers to the fire with tobacco and try to really let them know that to be thankful for the things around them. And it's not just during Thanksgiving is the thing. It's not like it's, oh, yep, Thanksgiving's coming up. You guys better be thankful for something. No, it's an everyday thing for us.
The myth of Thanksgiving, you know, it's very damaging. It's damaging to Native people because it's not true, and other people believe it. And when we go to explain the actual history or the events that happened during that time period in the early 17th century when the harvest event that became known as the first Thanksgiving happened, when we go to explain about that, we get challenged, we get pushback. So it's very frustrating, it can be angering, it's insulting, and I also think it's damaging for non-Native people because they're believing a lie.
So the myth of Thanksgiving really, you know, has been tossed around and utilized across the United States to really show that it was a happy, grand experience and, you know, really to justify a lot of the taking of our lands and the, you know, utilization of our resources and the, you know, a lot of the wrongdoings that have been done, and it brushes those off and sort of plays everything out to be, you know, a happy family event that, you know, is now perpetuated, and this myth is shown in schools and, you know, all around the United States during this time of year. And as an Indigenous person, it's really, you know, disheartening to see, you know, people celebrating this Thanksgiving and not really giving thanks in the same way that Thanksgiving was brought about.
The fact is that, yes, two groups of people did come together and they feasted for 3 days. The other sort of narrative about the happiness and the happily ever after, that is definitely fabricated, or it hasn't been proven. We don't really know what the circumstances were.
The myth created around Thanksgiving has done great harm to Native Americans and our place in this country, and our perception and how historically it's taught, you know, that the Pilgrims came together and we all sat around and had a big feast, is not accurate. And it's hurtful and harmful to think that, you know, this very important, pivotal time for Native people is completely overlooked in American society. And it's not addressed in our school systems, and it's the type of history, you know, there's certain people that don't want taught.
So many people don't know who Wampanoag people are, you know, and now that they do know, well, then we have just one role in history, and that is because we didn't let the Pilgrims die. We helped them to survive.
It marks this beginning of a dark period in history for the Wampanoag people. And it's a history that is just completely ignored. You know, it didn't align with what was needed when sort of the Thanksgiving holiday was created after the Civil War. And so it instead just gets pushed aside, and it's ignored. And as a Native American, that's a painful thing. You know, you don't want to think that your history and your people are being ignored, but that's exactly what has happened.
The foods that have become traditional for Thanksgiving, you know, most of it is traditional Wampanoag food. Turkey, corn, green beans, squash, pumpkin, cranberries. So I don't have a problem with a turkey dinner, you know, because that meal, or those foods anyway, have also been co-opted out of, our Wampanoag culture and into the mainstream.
It's more than just turkey. We had, of course, everything. We're still clamming because we can clam all year long. We had a lot of clams and duck because the ducks are migrating that time of year. So ducks and geese were a part of the meals, which went on for days and days. Also deer, of course, it's the beginning of the deer season. So there'd be a lot of roasted deer meat, roasted corn cakes, roasted right in the fire. Just the seasonal fruit, which is the cranberry, sasamaniash. So we'd have lots of breads and corn ground together with nut meats. So we made some really flavorful dishes like an oatmeal. And that's called nasomp. And we would have that as well, where you could just dip the duck meat and all the delicious the gravy from the duck meat into the nasomp.
One way that we can celebrate Thanksgiving in a traditional indigenous way, whether you're native or non-native, is by eating those same foods and honoring those foods. Thanksgiving is about the food. It's about enjoying your harvest, and it's about abundance when you're entering a time where, the earth starts to fall asleep and when things start to get cold. And so it's about really filling your belly and eating and enjoying those delicious, nutritious foods with friends and family. In 2020, I will say a very practical way to honor those food traditions is by using your dollars. There are many, many native food companies out there. They are producing and shipping nationally and internationally all your smoked salmons, all of your berries, all of your wild rice, your corn, pretty much anything you can think of. There is a native company that is producing those foods. I would suggest that people buy those foods and cook them and eat them at your Thanksgiving meal. That's one way to indigenize Thanksgiving.
We have everybody in the country celebrating this in a way that isn't true to the history. They're not telling the truth about the history of what happened and how it happened. The truth of the matter is, before they got here, there was a pandemic that killed almost 500,000 people. And when they got here, they didn't respect our sovereignty on our own land, and to this day have not respected our sovereignty on our own land. And we have degrees of sovereignty, but no native really has sovereignty in America.
The only thing that's in the colonial record about the first Thanksgiving, or rather I should say the event that came to be known as the first Thanksgiving, is a small inclusion in Morse Relation, or whichever volume it's in. It's like one long page of Mort relating all of this stuff that was going on, and he gets to the part where he's talking about the governor sent 4 men on fowling, and Massasoit came amongst us with 90 men, and they stayed and feasted and played games for 3 days. That little section, that's all there is in reference to what has become the hoopla of the first Thanksgiving.
We had several Thanksgivings. We gave thanks every day for what was put here for us. So of course we give thanks for things that sustain your life and your family's life, and everybody that came before us. And but they were big celebrations, like big community celebrations for the green corn, right? Because the corn is our staple, is our life sustainer, along with the beans and the squash. So we would give thanks for the green corn harvest. And it was really a time where a lot of the work was done. So it was a time where there was a lot of rejoicing and lots of singing and dancing. Games were played, honor games.
Really what's most important about, Thanksgiving is, understanding the indigenous perspective on Thanksgiving, and really, thinking back to what the indigenous people did for the pilgrims, what they really provided. You know, they gave them safe harbor, they gave them a place to stay, they gave them, you know, the ability to live and thrive. I think a lot of the disappointment, you know, about Thanksgiving was brought on by a lot of the things after that happened after the first Thanksgiving. But the histories aren't as important to me as like being able to raise these children in a world where they don't feel hurt or broken down by the masses of people who misunderstand Thanksgiving and don't really understand that there's indigenous people who've had, since Thanksgiving, had a long history of people not following that tradition. And what I would have to say to people in the United States is that, you know, to follow the, you know, the meaning of Thanksgiving is to be thankful, to be respectful, to be caring for other people, to be giving, and not just to you and your own, not just to you and your family, but to strangers, to homeless people, to people that have nothing, people that are just trying to survive. That's what the indigenous people did for, you know, for the newcomers, the people who came across the sea on the ships. They provided them food and safety and knowledge and understanding and everything that they could to help them live and thrive.
One of the things that people are most surprised of is that we do sit down and have a dinner very similar to everyone else's dinner on that day. What we do prior to that is probably a little bit different. And, you know, we do remember everything that happened in the past.
Lucky the battery held up to the first one. Well, I'm going to turn on the lights and I'll have something yellow on here. This is some traditional buffalo stew that we would have, and welcome to some. You can get a bowl, and I've got some dried plums, I've got some berries. Before we get started, I want to say a few words of thanks. Put that in. Thank you so much. Save the day. There with the offering, we always take food from our meal. We just take just a little bit. I take some pictures? Okay. That's still.
Mushroom? What is this?
No, those are dried plums.
Oh, dried plums.
Yeah, help loosen you up if you're needing help.
Useful.
Yeah, take as much as you like. Have seconds. There's only, we kind of figured on at least 20, so there's plenty of food. You can even take some with you, if you like. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Help yourself. Got some dried plums, some berries, little fried rice, and stew. Well, we're going to get started with the second film I have, which is about the first meal that was considered Thanksgiving meal. And it was comprised of deer meat along with turkey and whatever was back there. Then we had squash. We just got done serving or providing some food here for those who came today. On the menu was buffalo. They were the ribs of the buffalo, and of course I took the ribs out, and it's really nice and tender if you let it cook all day. So it's cooked for a couple days, and yeah, help yourself. Oh, okay. Yeah.
What kind of berries are they?
Those are what we call buffalo berries.
I was thinking
Yeah.
that they,
Right.
yeah.
Yeah, I've had them. I've shared some with you before. I think it
Right.
was last year,
Right,
but they were
well,
dry.
earlier this fall,
Right.
or summer,
Right.
late summer.
And then I brought some choke cherries.
Choke cherries.
Right. Yeah. So this kind of meal would be what we would have for our ceremonies. So we have sweat ceremonies. That's a ceremony where you go into a sweat lodge and you pray and you sing and you bring in lava rocks and you pour rocks or water on the rocks and it creates steam. That whole ceremony is done in the dark, and in the dark we can't see, but the spirits can see us, and so there's a lot of blessings that go on in that darkness. Those of us that have gifts, we can see and feel them, so we know what's going on. A lot of times I just can sense when something is there, and I chose buffalo this time because our people, that's not going to stop ringing. Because our people are very guarded with their game. We don't allow women on their monthly to eat our food, the game, because it causes bad luck for the hunter. And I've had that happen to me a few times. I've served game during some of our ceremonies, and a lot of times at our ceremonies, other family other than who are in the ceremony come, and so there was one young lady that came and I didn't see that she was there who ate my meat. And I went hunting after that, and I shot, couldn't hit anything the rest of the season. You have to have, in this case, my mother was the one who prayed over my gun, and following the season I could hit him again. And so chose buffalo because it's we sell buffalo commercially, and so this was our wild buffalo. We do nothing to them outside of just prepare them to sell. So it's good wild buffalo. So with that, I'm going to get started here. How's the food?
It's delicious.
Good.
It surely is.
For being one of the most famous meals in American history, we actually don't know all that much about what we now call the first Thanksgiving in 1621, especially when it comes to the food that they ate, though that's not going to stop me from trying to make something that might have been served. Sobaheg, a venison stew from the Wampanoag Nation. So thank you to Babbel for sponsoring this video as we cobble together the first Thanksgiving meal, this time on Tasting History. So like I said, we don't actually know all that much about that three-day feast in 1621 because there are very few contemporary resources that wrote about it, and those that we do have are decidedly from one side of the table, which they probably didn't have a table. And much of what we think we know actually comes from stories written in the 1800s and even early 1900s to give an origin story to a relatively new holiday. Because at the 1621 feast, they wouldn't have called it Thanksgiving. To the Pilgrims, a day of Thanksgiving was a day spent often fasting and silently in prayer, quite the opposite of what we do now. That said, there was likely a three-day feast held at the Plymouth Plantation in 1621, and present were 53 pilgrims from England and nearly 100 men from the local Wampanoag Nation. Edward Winslow wrote, "Many of the Indians coming amongst us, and amongst the rest their greatest king Massasoit, with some 90 men, whom for 3 days we entertained and feasted. And they went out and killed 5 deer, which they brought to the plantation and bestowed on our governor and upon the captain and others." Other than a previous mention of hunting birds, he doesn't mention any other foods that were served, nor how they were prepared. But as the Wampanoag brought 5 deer, we can assume that maybe they had some hand in how it was cooked. One traditional way would have been in a stew. Years later, other Algonquin languages called this sapahik, or sobaheg. And the theme of language really runs through this entire story. So it's very fitting that the sponsor for today's video is Babbel, because Babbel is one of the top language learning apps in the world, and it's easy to see why, because the lessons are written by actual language teachers and are meant to prepare you for real-life situations. And the courses are 10 to 15 minutes long, so you can fit in a lesson while you're waiting for your crème anglaise to thicken. El patio es rojo. I'm working on my Spanish because I want to go to La Casa Azul, or the Blue House in Mexico, to learn how to make Frida Kahlo's mole, a wonderfully...
He gets into a whole language trip here for a while.
historically accurate than grits, because that is made from your subscription. So we can all learn a new language while we wait for our venison stew to cook. So for this recipe, what you'll need is 1 to 2 pounds or a half kilogram of venison, a half pound or 225 grams of dried beans, a half pound or 225 grams of polenta. So while polenta is Italian, it is made with flint corn, which would have been the corn that was grown in the area in the 17th century. So it's going to be more historically accurate than grits, because that is made from dent corn. But you can still use grits. You're not going to notice a huge difference. 1 pound or 450 grams of winter squash, a handful of fresh herbs. I'm using sage and mint, but you can use pretty much any herbs that you want. Also, I'm leaving them whole or just torn in half because they are going to be in there for quite some time. But if you want to add chopped herbs, you can add those later on in the recipe. What you do want to chop is some green onion. And if you have access to wild onion or wild garlic, those are actually going to be even better, but they can be rather hard to find. Now, With any of these ingredients, you can add more or less of whatever you want. Like, if 2 pounds of squash end up falling into my pot, I'm not gonna be mad because I really, really like squash. The one thing you do want to start with a small amount of is clam juice. Go with about a 1/4 cup or 60 milliliters to start. This is basically going to be the salt of the dish and was a popular and still is a popular ingredient in that part of the US, mostly now for clam chowder, but it was used in a lot of things earlier on, and it does add kind of a brininess, but it can very quickly become overpowering. So start off with a 1/4 cup, you can add more later on. So 3 of these ingredients are paramount to this dish: the beans, the squash, and the corn or maize. These were the 3 staples of the diet throughout much of North America and were called the 3 sisters because of how they grew together. Rather than planting them in separate fields, they were grown together to create a symbiotic plant complex. Really good band name. As the cornstalk grows, it acts as a trellis for the climbing beans, and the climbing beans act as a stabilizer for the cornstalk in high winds. The beans also regulate the nitrogen in the soil. The squash then grows along the ground, and its leaves shade the soil so it stays moist and prevents weeds from establishing. So before you add the 3 sisters to the stew, you're going to want to chop your venison into small pieces and then sear them in a lightly greased pan over high heat. Now, this is not absolutely necessary, but I do find that it really kind of develops the flavor, and really the best way to do it would be over an open fire, but I don't have an open fire, so I'm using a pan with some duck fat, but you can also use any oil that you want. And just give the meat a light sear and then rinse your beans. Now, if you are in the camp of you must soak your beans overnight, go ahead and do that. I have found that it doesn't really affect the flavor, and it only cuts down on the cook time by about 20 or 25 minutes, so I don't really find it worth it. Instead, I just toss them into the pot with about 3 quarts of water, then add the ground corn and the seared meat, the onion, herbs, and clam juice. The only thing you should be holding back is the squash. Then stir everything together and set it over medium-high heat and bring it to a simmer. And while it's on the high heat, really make sure to keep stirring the pot. The corn will fall to the bottom and will burn to the bottom of the pot, so you don't want that. Once it starts to simmer, lower the heat to medium so it stays at a gentle simmer, stirring it often and skimming off any foam that collects on the top. Keep an eye on it as it cooks for the next 2.5 hours or until the beans are soft. Now, it will thicken naturally because of the corn, but it will also thicken because of the steam. The water will boil away. You do want it thick, but if too much water boils away, bad things will happen. It will start to burn, so add some more hot water if necessary. Either way, keep stirring it every once in a while because the goal is to not let anything burn to the bottom of the pot. A goal which I did not achieve, so avenge me while I tell you about some of the food at that first Thanksgiving. So to talk about the food that they might have eaten at that harvest festival in 1621, it is important to talk about why they were having that harvest festival. And that story actually starts years before any pilgrim got on any Mayflower. Around the year 1600, in the area that is now southeast Massachusetts and Rhode Island, the Wampanoag Nation flourished. Wampanoag meaning people of the first light, as they extended all the way to the eastern coast, allowing them to see the sun's first rays. One of the many tribes that made up the nation was the Patuxet tribe, to which Tesquantum, later known as Squanto, belonged. Now, they had been in contact with Europeans for the better part of a century, during which time things had been relatively peaceful, namely because there were a lot of people living in the area, and so the Europeans could just trade and then pretty much had to get back on their boats and leave. But around the turn of the century, a practice started of kidnapping the young men during these trades and selling them into slavery. And that is, in 1605, what happened to Tesquantum. He was carried away with diverse others by one Hunt, a master of a ship who thought to sell them for slaves in Spain. But he got away for England and was entertained by a merchant in London. While in London, Tesquantum learned English, and then he got a job on a ship that first took him to Newfoundland and finally home in late 1619. But when he walked into his village of Patuxet, it was empty. In fact, most of the land around Cape Cod was completely devoid of any people, because while he had been away, European traders had brought a new disease for which the native population had no immunity. It might have been yellow fever, it might have been smallpox, there's still debate, nobody really knows What they do know is that 75 to 90% of the people living in the area were dead in 3 years. This depopulation left the Wampanoag Nation vulnerable to attack from their neighbor to the west, the Narragansett, who had been very little affected by the disease due to natural barriers. The chief, or sachem, of the Wampanoag was understandably on edge and rather wary of Europeans or those sailing with them. His name was Osamaquin, though is better known by his title Massasoit, or Great Sachem. So fast forward a year, and another English ship arrives, the Mayflower. They first landed on the tip of Cape Cod in November of 1620, then crossed the bay to settle in Patuxet, the abandoned village that Tisquantum had once called home. Of course, those on the Mayflower didn't know that that was what it was called, so they named it New Plymouth, after the English port from which they'd sailed. These are the Pilgrims, though they wouldn't have called themselves that. Half of them were the English Puritan sect called the Separatists, who actually spent most of the last 12 years living in Holland. That didn't work out, so they asked the King of England for a charter to go to the New World, which is why they were on the Mayflower. And while they were aboard the Mayflower, they called themselves saints. So much for humility. The other half of the passengers they referred to as strangers, though I'm going to guess that after several months on a small ship, there were no strangers amongst the 102 pilgrims. Now, if you have ever been to Massachusetts in November and December, you'll know that it's not the best time of year to be setting up a new settlement, especially when, for all of their gumption, the Pilgrims were woefully unprepared for this trip. See, they planned on doing a lot of fishing, but it turns out none of them really knew how to fish, especially in large quantities. And they brought some food with them, but not enough of the staples to last them for an entire season. So the Pilgrims actually lived on the Mayflower for those first few months while they slowly built a new settlement on land. And they lived partly off of food that they brought with them, but mostly off of the food that they found when they got onto land. William Bradford said that they found corn next to the graves of the natives that were there. And from abandoned houses and storage pits, they took fair Indian baskets filled with corn, and some in ears, fair and good, of diverse colors, which seem a very goodly sight. They also found beans, and it was these foods that really sustained them for that first winter. Even so, it wasn't really enough, and with a terrible bout of scurvy, half of the Pilgrims died in those first few months. But on March 16th, 1621, a man named Samoset walked into the settlement and greeted them in English. And in a contemporary description of the event, we actually hear about some of the food that they still had left. Samoset asked for a beer, and instead they gave him hardtack. We gave him strong water and biscuit, and butter and cheese and pudding, and a piece of mallard. A week later, he returned with another man who spoke perfect English, the last Patuxet, Tisquantum, who William Bradford nicknamed Squanto. He was the translator between the English and Massasoit when Massasoit first came and they signed a treaty of mutual protection. If the Narragansett or anyone else attacked either party, the other party would come to their aid. He also taught the Pilgrims a lot about farming in the new land. He taught them about the Three Sisters and how to gather the mussels and clams and lobsters that were right outside their door. Tisquantum went to fish for eels. At night he came home with as many as he could well lift in one hand, which our people were glad of. They were fat and sweet. He trod them out with his feet, and so caught them with his hands without any other instrument. With Squanto's help, William Bradford said, all the summer there was no want, and now began to come in store of fowl, of which this place did abound. And besides waterfowl, there was great store of wild turkeys, of which they took many, besides venison, etc. Besides, they had a peck of meal a week to a person, or now, since harvest, Indian corn to that proportion. Other foods they wrote of included great stores of fruit. There was likewise walnuts, chestnuts, small nuts, and plums, roots and herbs. No place hath more gooseberries and strawberries, nor better, and great flocks of turkey, quails, pigeons, and partridges. Many great lakes abounding with fish, fowl, beavers, and otters. The barley and wheat, which the Pilgrims had brought with them and expected to be their main food source as it had in England, failed to thrive. But with Squanto's help, they found new crops that did thrive. And sometime between September and November of 1621, our harvest being gotten in, our governor sent 4 men on fowling. That so we might, after a special manner, rejoice together, after we had gathered the fruits of our labors. They four in one day killed as much fowl as with a little help beside served the company almost a week, at which time, amongst other recreations, we exercised our arms. That is, they fired off their guns, and that line has been the source of speculation for years, because the next line is when Massasoit and his 90 warriors arrive. But there's no explanation of why they arrive. Was it because they heard the gunfire? And if so, was it because they thought that the Pilgrims were coming to attack them? Or were they going to honor their treaty of protection, thinking that someone else might be attacking the Pilgrims? Who knows? Because the next thing that they mention is that they go get 5 deer and for the next 3 days eat and play games together. That was the first Thanksgiving, even if they wouldn't have called it that. Now, within just a few weeks of this feast, more English arrive. There was also conflict between Squanto and Massasoit. But amazingly, while there was plenty of conflict between the other Puritans coming over and many of the other tribes in the area, the treaty between the Pilgrims and the Wampanoag actually lasted for 50 years. Basically, the entire life of those who were there. It was the next generation where things fell apart. And in the 1670s, in a conflict called King Philip's War, the Wampanoag Nation was all but wiped out, and basically anyone that was left was sold into slavery. Now, it's easy to think about that short period of time around the first Thanksgiving when everything on the surface seems to be going so well. But I think when you're enjoying your Thanksgiving this year, it's just as important to remember the years before, the circumstances that led Squanto to being able to speak English, and the land was devoid of people for the Pilgrims to set up on, as well as the years afterward, from which many have still yet to recover, which is why, as part of my giving thanks for everything that I have this year, I am supporting what I think is a wonderful cause, the Wampanoag Language Reclamation Project. After 150 years of dormancy, they are bringing back and reclaiming the Wampanoag language, mostly by using historic documents, which I think is so cool. And I think it is so important to have this language thriving because it is so important to American history.
Stop it right there. I also had planned to have a friend of mine who is Wampanoag, but she had a bad cold and I didn't want her to expose anybody and she didn't want to really come out. But she was the one who had told me about these videos and that they would be a good source to share with people. And you've all seen the statue of Massasoit up to the Capitol, right? Yeah, I forget which governor liked that image so well that they had a statue done a long time ago, and it has moved various places around the Capitol, and it was one time down on, I think it was State Street, and but that's how that came to be here. And I always scratch my head, why is that from Massasoit here? But yeah, that's the end of the story. She also told me that the word powwow came from their people. Back when our people couldn't do our ceremonies and we had to go underground, everybody would go to powwow's place to have ceremonies. And as we know today, that's come to be known as what we do when we have our social dances, powwow. So it all began from this man's name and having to go undercover to do our ceremonies or their ceremonies. And we were no different. We had to hide what we did here until, it wasn't until the 90s that we got the Freedom of Religion Act for natives. Really? But it was in the 1920s that we could at least bring them out in the open. But it was in the 90s that it was actually in a legal form of the Freedom of Religion Act. And Native people are the only ones who can acquire and maintain eagle feathers. And so there's repositories in Colorado, I think that's in Denver, that you can request those, and you have to prove your blood, which tribe you're enrolled with. You have to have a spiritual leader sign off on it. And so it's a real process. It's not just given out to anybody, and you have to state your purpose for them. And so that's how a lot of the regalia you see at the powwows we've acquired, and they're traded back and forth. Somebody might need a bustle, eagle bustle, but they might need something else, and you would trade for those, and that's how it all happens. Well, it's been my pleasure to present this to you today, and hope you enjoyed the food. Like I say, that was my first attempt at fry bread, and I took a bite, and it was like trying to chew leather. And those who tried it, you know what I mean.
It was good in the stew.
Yeah, stew was good.
It was my first piece.
Yeah.
So I didn't have anything to compare it to,
okay.
and I ate it all.
Oh, yeah,
It was
man.
great, thank you.
Some of the ladies, they do, well, you've had scones in restaurants, it's like that. So it's really flaky, and there's a lot of air in the bread. I think I didn't let mine rise long enough, and then after I made my first batch, the lady who told me about it, she told me to use metal gold because the baking powder is already in it, and those were out of the commodities that they used to give us as rations. So that's ingenuity to put that flour and water and baking powder together to create fry bread. But the lady who told me about the medical said, well, for real nice fry bread, you want to use milk, half water and half milk, and it makes it rise a lot better. Well, first shot. I'll give it a try next time, and if I do better, I'll bring some back for y'all to sample. Yeah. So thank you all for coming. Have a great Thanksgiving. Remember what you've seen. It's no different than July 24th is celebrated here. It was at our expense. All of that land out there that was taken from the 8 Utah tribes. And it's celebrated, but not so much as we celebrate it. It's not a good day. But that's all part of history, and we carry on. So have a nice Thanksgiving, and catch you next month. Will be the last month for this year.
Thank you, Larry.
Yep.
Thank you for sharing.
Thank you all. Great. Well, your little setup there seemed to work very well.